Thank you. Just to add to both my colleagues, on Mike's last point, if you hadn't mentioned the absence of the reference, I was going to mention it myself. And in a military context, it does also have implications, because there are at least three possible military implications that one can think of. Already in the last administration, there was some discussion about pulling the American forces from the Sinai. Forces that might be used better elsewhere, some were suggesting. If anybody doesn't know, there are American forces in the Sinai that help patrol the Egypt-Israel peace. Secondly, there was some considerable discussion recently about the potential for America and or NATO playing a role in terms of the final resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And then third, for many years, there's been discussion of a potential American-led role, multinational sort of role on the Golan Heights. So one can imagine in an era of peace a lot more that some parties would like to see America play a role, precisely at a time when, as you say, or at least he implies by the absence of reference, the stamina to take on these additional roles certainly may not be there. The other point I wanted to make is very interesting, Jim, your focus on strategic communications and your reference to the administration and Mullen's role on The Daily Show, because the article that to which Mike made reference, that Admiral Mullen wrote about strategic communications, is in fact a very powerful critique of how strategic communications has come to dominate acts of policy. I'll quote from it just for a moment. Quote, "I know strategic communications," this is Admiral Mullen's article that Mike was making reference to. "I know strategic communications as a term of reference is probably here to stay. Regrettably, it's grown too much a part of our lexicon. To put it simply, we need to worry a lot less about how to communicate our actions and much more about what our actions communicate." And you said that in the context of almost doing the exact opposite, with, as you say, that this administration is focusing so greatly about it. Lots to talk about. Let me open the floor for your questions and your comments. Yes, please, if you could take the mic.
Thank you, Rob. Tom Levin, Council on Foreign Relations. Jim, you mentioned the vacuum of information on the subject of Iran. And Mike, you talked about a strategic architecture in the Gulf to confront the confrontation of a nuclear Iran. I was hoping the Admiral would help us understand what Secretary Clinton meant last summer when she talked about the possibility of the defense umbrella among our allies in the Gulf to confront a nuclear-armed Iran. I haven't heard about that since. Is anything happening on that front? Who is in charge of strategic planning for the confrontation of a nuclear Iran?
Mike?
The short answer is I don't really know what's being done. And of course I assume any planning that is being done would presumably be done by CENTCOM in consultation with the Joint Staff and OSD and State. But I think this is one of the Secretary of State's comment. I think was. And the reason why we haven't heard anything more about it since then was recognized as premature and potentially having a harmful impact on the perceptions of allies in the region who are looking at Iran's progress in the nuclear arena and reconsidering their own options. And the challenge that we face in dealing with this eventuality is that on the one hand, we can't afford to do things which send a signal to our allies that we perhaps are acquiescing in the eventuality of a nuclear Iran. On the other hand, there are things we need to be doing now to lay the groundwork in case that is where we end up, and how you kind of strike the right balance is it's doable, but it's a challenge. But the bottom line is, there is an architecture in place that was built mainly during the 90s in the wake of Operation Desert Storm, in terms of a web of bilateral and multilateral relationships with the Gulf states, which we can build on, and which is mainly in the conventional arena. And there is a very solid foundation there. So there's a lot that's already been done that we can build on. The question is, what role do our nuclear weapons play in the event that Iran acquires nuclear weapons? And I'll just say simply that I think we need to think long and hard about this because the context is much different than that of Europe. And I'm not sure we've thought through all the implications of changing our declaratory policy with regard in this arena, in this area, and therefore it's better that we think through all the implications before we make statements about our willingness to extend a nuclear security umbrella to the Gulf. So,
Jim?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's some interesting continuity on this point. During the Bush administration, there was discussion about a nuclear umbrella, a doctrine that would be directed at reassuring Arab states in the Gulf, Arab states at large, that they would be protected against an Iranian nuclear weapon if it came into being, and therefore they did not have to develop their own. That was also directed toward Turkey. And Turkey, I remember a conversation I had with then Foreign Minister Gul at the time about Turkey, whether or not Turkey was interested in acquiring nuclear weapons. And he said, no, there's no need. We understand from the United States that we have protection on this front. I think that no longer necessarily applies, but it was an interesting insight. Secretary Clinton had talked during the campaign about a strategic umbrella for Israel specifically, which would I believe she specified Israel. I may be wrong on that, but the context made it pretty clear. And so that's really the question involved here. If we have a strategic or a defensive umbrella, it's an effort to prevent the Arabs from going nuclear, on the one hand, and reassuring the Israelis that they don't have to strike. At that particular time, that seemed to be the emphasis. It's clear now that it will be much more difficult than it would have been, say, 3, 4, 5 years ago with the Arab states, because as a senior Arab political official who was in town recently said to a small group of us, it's clear that there is already activity underway on the Arab side on developing nuclear weapons. No details to provide. Rob, can I just
Sure.
also, I think this is a good example, but I didn't quite expand enough, I think, on what are the costs of the kind of paying more attention to communications or statements than the policy itself. And it came out, I thought, very well in the Admiral's remarks, and particularly in his response to Steve Solars's question, where in the first part of his remarks, Admiral Mullen was telling us that he finds a great fear when he talks to the Pakistanis and Afghans about you're going to leave us again. And he's telling them, no, we're going to be with you this time. And then when he's asked by Steve, why is it different? His answer is, we have no intention of staying. We have no intention of occupying the country. Indeed, the message from this administration is that we will, to the Afghans, is we will leave on deadlines that will be primarily set unilaterally. They can be flexible, but the message there's a message dissonance here, because the president is speaking primarily to the domestic audience when he's saying, we are leaving. And he's speaking to the Afghans when he says, we are staying. But of course, both audiences hear both messages.